I am assuming some of you guys are living in Australia and aware that Australia has the most expensive housing market in the world, both in terms of renting and buying. For those that doesn't know, Australia has 8 cities. Out of these 8 cities, 5 of them are in the top 20 most expensive housing markets in the world. The other 3 are not too far off in terms of how expensive they are. We are not talking about niche suburbs or holiday destinations like Lake Como or Monte Carlo here. We are talking about average, normal day-to-day cities where normal working class people live, eat, and work, that consists of factories and grocery stores. This means that most of the country in terms of cities makes up 25% of the top 20 most expensive real estate market in the world. You might be thinking, since the houses are really expensive, they must be big and high quality. No, most of them are shoeboxes and subpar. So what's really causing the housing crisis in Australia? I'll get straight to the point. The main culprit is mass migration. As with anything you have to pay money for in the modern economy, the price of housing is determined by supply and demand. For years, politicians and the mainstream media have been trying to gaslight us into believing it's a supply issue. It is true that when supply is less than the demand, the price goes up, but the context here is important. Australia is in the top 3 countries in the world for dwellings built per citizen. It is one of the biggest countries with lowest population densities. It's not like we are running out of space, so supply is not an issue. Imagine your mate is one of the richest people in the town and always complains about how broke he is while the rest of the town is getting by. At some point you have to say, mate, maybe you don't have an income problem, maybe you have a spending problem. And to make the issue more terrifying, Australia actually has a surplus of houses if you take Australian citizens into the equation. Australia's problem is excessive demand driven by mass migration. In the context of housing, there are 3 types of demand, what I call the official, artificial, and economic demand. Official demand is generated in a country through natural birth rates of its citizens. This means when people get married and make babies, and as these babies grow into adulthood, they will need a place of their own to live. For a country to maintain its population, it needs to have a birth rate of 2.1, also called the replacement level. Australia's replacement level has been below 2.1 since the mid-70s. So if there was no immigration, Australia's population would have been decreasing since the 70s, and this would have left behind a surplus of houses. With more houses and fewer buyers, Australia's housing would have gotten cheaper over time adjusted to inflation. Keynote here is that a house is not a disposable good, it's an asset. Generally speaking, if we had a population that stayed perfectly the same, there wouldn't be any quote-unquote supply. Instead of building new houses, we would renovate and pass the existing houses to each other, one generation after another. Again, generally speaking, any new house that is built to accommodate for the population increase. Artificial demand is generated by immigration. Virtually all of the demand for housing in the last 2 decades is the product of government's aggressive immigration policies. When immigrants come here, they don't come with a house on their back. The supply of new houses being built in Australia falls below the demand generated by immigrants year after year. When more people compete for few available houses either for rent or purchase, it will raise the prices. Right now we are in a position where the amount of renters far exceed the amount of rentals. The reason we don't have mass homelessness is because a lot of adults live in shared accommodation as housemates. Sometimes you get 4 or 5 people living in the same house. As rents get higher, shared accommodation will be more common. Economic demand is generated by a high level of tourism. The easiest way to explain this is to imagine a really nice seaside town with amazing nature that gets lots of tourists. Eventually you will get people with big cash that will want to either buy a holiday house or buy it as an investment property to rent it out, which will push dwelling prices higher than what it should be. So locals will not only be competing for purchasing houses, but they will also be competing for renting, as there will be more people trying to relocate permanently into this town or deal with the conversion of rentals into Airbnbs to accommodate for tourists. The easiest example I can give from top of my head in Victoria would be Mount Billa, even though it's up in the mountains. This demand generally applies to small towns or really small countries, so it doesn't apply to Australia as a whole. We do get tourists, but nothing crazy to push the house prices up really high or have any significant impact on rents. I do recognize Airbnbs are a problem, but in my opinion, it's not as big as the topics I will be discussing. Immigration is a big and complex topic, so I'm not going to go into too much details in this video. By government statistics, on average, Australia imports 500,000 immigrants every year. It's a population of 27 million. Out of this 27 million, 3 million of them are on temporary visas. These include things like working visas, international students, and long-term holiday visas. And out of 27 million, I'd say at least another 1.5 million on permanent visas. These are the people that can stay in Australia indefinitely as long as they renew their visa every few years and don't commit a major crime. It's like being a citizen without having an actual citizenship. It makes it easy for groups like Indians who can't have dual citizenship to reside in Australia permanently. I couldn't get the latest data on this topic. The latest one is from ABS, published in 2021. 30% of Australia's population was born overseas, and we have 8 million immigrants. These figures might be somewhat tricky because if an immigrant couple makes a baby, even if they are on permanent residency visa, their kid will be classed as born in Australia and an Australian citizen by legal and census standards, even though he is a second-generation immigrant. Australia has around 800,000 international students, which is 10% globally, give or take. The excessive amount of international students also drives up the rents, especially in one-bedroom and studio apartment market. I'm talking about these figures not to demonize immigrants, but to point out sheer population increase. What these numbers show us is that Australia has one of the highest number of immigrants and immigration rates per capita in the world. You do get some countries with higher immigration rate per capita, but the context is important here. Consider UAE, for example, which has higher immigration rate per capita. UAE is like an investment capital of the world where a significant amount of world's millionaires and billionaires reside. It's a travel destination for the world's elite expats. Has an abundance of wealth generated through export of fossil fuel, which they use it to undertake major infrastructure projects, and needs to have an underclass of foreign workers on temporary visas to serve this infrastructure expansion and its elite class. This economic and social climate is very different to Australia. It is also important to point out, even though UAE has more immigrants per capita, it is almost impossible to get UAE citizenship, and temporary immigrants are actually indeed really temporary. The main argument we hear is that temporary migrants and international students go back. Yes, we do have a constant outflow of immigrants and students, some of them do go back, but half, if not most, stay in Australia. It is important to point out that those who come here use their temporary visas as a gateway to stay in Australia, as long as you don't commit a major crime. It's not really difficult to get first a student visa, then permanent visa, then citizenship, etc. Even though living standards have fallen off drastically over the last few years, Australia is still a very desirable place to live compared to most other countries. There have been other factors negatively affecting the housing market too. First factor is free grants by the government. Instead of limiting immigration and thus reducing demand, Australia has opted for other options like the first-time owners grant or the 5% deposit scheme that went into effect where the government guarantees the rest of your 20% deposit. The problem with these or any other grants is that it only increases the demand and raises the prices coupled with continuous immigration. If native potential buyers can borrow more to buy a house, then they will, which will then increase the prices. You might say, are you suggesting Australians shouldn't buy a house? I'm saying one segment of the population shouldn't buy a house, which are the potential immigrants who have not yet come to Australia. Speaking of rough numbers, if 100,000 permanent immigrants are coming to Melbourne every year, they will put significant strains on housing market, whether they want to buy or rent. Second factor is negative gearing. For those outside of Australia, what negative gearing is that you can offset your losses from your real estate investments from your personal income tax. Let's just say you are a doctor who recently bought an investment house and it's making losses because the rent you are receiving is less than the mortgage repayment. What you do is you go to the tax office and your losses gets taken off your income tax bill. The problem with this is that it makes real estate investing virtually risk-free for Australia's rich, and rich people are the only ones who can afford to buy their second house in Australia right now. And at every house auction, you have doctors, lawyers, and cashed-up boomers and the rich outbidding first-home buyers and increasing the demand and prices on houses. Third factor is overseas buying. The government has allowed internationals from overseas who are not even living in Australia to buy Australian property in order to money launder and create a safe haven for their cash. For example, if you're a Chinese millionaire, your money is not 100% safe in China. If you have hundreds of millions of dollars, it's not a bad idea to pour down $5 or $10 million on Australian real estate in case Chinese government confiscates your assets. On the news, apparently there have been attempts to stamp out this problem, but there are still loopholes to get around it. The biggest problem with this, apart from the obvious one, is that significant amount of these overseas buyers are not renting out these houses, which creates a decrease in rental supply. Fourth factor is regulation. Anyone who reads a little bit of economics knows that too much regulation is bad for the economy and generally makes things more expensive. Australia is one of the most regulated economies in the world, and the construction industry is no different. Obviously, you need to have some regulation in construction. There has to be sturdy foundations and stuff, but there needs to be a sweet spot. I haven't looked too deep into the amount of and specifics of it, but I know that Australian construction is rife with regulations. If you know or work in construction industry, please let us know in the comments section of all the unnecessary regulations you have come across. One thing I can point out is that in Australia apprenticeships takes too long. It shouldn't be 6 months or 1 year, but in my opinion, 4 years is too much of a long time to be a qualified tradesman. So what are the solutions? All the plausible solutions revolve around immigration. The media is gaslighting us about supply, but it's all lies. Supply will never be the solution because of these 3 reasons. 1. It takes a long time to build a house, minimum 6 months, without skipping safety and quality standards. 2. There is only a certain amount of qualified tradesmen in Australia. The key word here is qualified, the only people who can do the job. There is no way on earth these men can double or triple their output. 3. The amount of supply they are insinuating in the media, if it was to happen, it would cause a price drop in the housing market. Laws of economy dictate when supply exceeds the demand, the prices must come down. And we have heard from both political parties that they do not want housing prices to come down. To put it simply, even if they could magically increase the supply to a significant amount to make a difference, they simply would not. In my opinion, if politicians genuinely want to fix the housing crisis, they have 2 options. The first and most radical option is de facto deportation and stop taking in any immigrants. This wouldn't actively involve loading people into planes. What the government will do is let the visas run out of temporary immigrants and not renew their visas, creating a mass exodus out of Australia. The cons of this solution would be an extreme market and economic correction in Australia, akin to the GFC crash of 2008 in America, and create a housing crash. The severity of the crash will depend on the number of people that would leave Australia. Even though this would be the quickest way to solve this problem, not a single politician in Australia have the balls to do this. So the possibility of this happening is virtually zero, even if you get a politician trying to fix the problem. The second option is a softcore solution that would involve cutting the current immigration rate more than half. My rough estimate would be 70% or higher. What this would do is allow the supply to catch up and surpass demand over the long term. I would say 5 to 10 years. On paper, the house prices wouldn't crash and maybe go up in value by 1% each year, but the inflation and wage increases would close the gap in between wages and house prices over time, until the houses become affordable. So far we have talked about housing market in terms of buying. It's important to point out too much immigration causes prices to go up in rental market as well, especially in the short term when they don't have enough money for a deposit unless they come here with millions of dollars. As of today, Australia is one of the most expensive countries in the world to rent a house. It's also important to point out, apart from the tax breaks, mass immigration is also the reason why property investing is so popular in Australia. Property investors, people buying their second or third house in Australia, are aware that there is a population boom in Australia, and there will always be a shortage of houses. That's why it's a reliable and profitable investment tool. Without mass migration, you will have less property investors. If you want to know more about this subject, follow Biko Konstantinos and Lithfor on YouTube, who is the head of macrobusiness.com, the only objective newspaper in Australia from what I've seen. I couldn't talk about everything because I don't want this video to be 10 hours long. If you want to talk about or point out some facts about this topic, like and subscribe if you want to help spread the message.